Let's focus on events in the Middle East. And in the past few hours, 90 Palestinians have been released from Offa prison in the occupied West Bank under the Gaza ceasefire deal with Hamas. 2 buses with tinted windows left the facility, which were later surrounded by jubilant crowds. Most of those freed were women. In Tel Aviv, crowds celebrated as 3 Israeli hostages were released by Hamas, handed over in dramatic scenes. Among them, 28-year-old Emily Damari, a British Israeli who was reunited with her mother. 24-year-old Romy Gonen and 31-year-old Doron Steinbrecher, who were both met by their mothers. Jonah Fisher reports from Jerusalem.
Free at last. After 15 months being held in Gaza, the first hostages released in this ceasefire deal were reunited with family and friends. Footage released by the Israeli authorities showing the moment Romy, Doron and the British-Israeli Emily arrived at a hospital near Tel Aviv.
I'm happy to report that they are in stable condition that allows us and them to focus on what is the most important thing for now, is reuniting with their families.
They're likely to spend several days in hospital to allow more assessment of their physical and mental condition. Earlier in the day, the women's journey to freedom had started in chaotic fashion. Hamas fighters were out in force to hand them over to the Red Cross. Israel fought this war with the aim of eliminating Hamas from Gaza. They've been greatly weakened and their leaders killed. But the PR message was clear. We're still here. The hostages were driven by the Red Cross to the Israeli military, and they were soon reunited with their mothers. In return for the 3 women being set free, Israel agreed to release 90 Palestinian prisoners. Outside Offa prison, crowds waited late into the night as checks were carried out inside. Then, in the early hours, came confirmation that the release had taken place. In Gaza itself, the guns did, after a small delay on Sunday morning, fall silent. For the nearly 2 million displaced, the focus is now on returning to find out what's left of home.
The halting of the bloodshed is an indescribable feeling. I thank God that I survived this war safely. However, when we returned to our homes, we found nothing but ruin and destruction. I cannot describe the scene in words. I don't know what to say.
It's likely to be an experience repeated again and again. 15 months of war and Israeli strikes has reduced much of Gaza to rubble. The fighting has now stopped and more aid should flow in. After so much misery, there is at least some grounds to hope. Jonah Fisher, BBC News, in Jerusalem.
Well, let's go live to Jerusalem now and speak to our Middle East correspondent, Yolande Nell. Good morning, Yolande. So it's been a very tense, tumultuous 24 hours. Talk us through what happens next.
Yeah, so what we've seen is the first day of this ceasefire deal expected to last at this stage, the first stage, for some 6 weeks. Now, we should see during this period a total of 33 of the remaining nearly 100 Israeli hostages held by Hamas in Gaza being released in exchange for a total of nearly 2,000 Palestinian prisoners who are held in Israeli jails, about half of those coming from Gaza and detained by Israel since the start of the war. Now, already we have been seeing Palestinians in Gaza, as Israeli forces have begun to withdraw, starting to move around. And they should be able to move much more freely after a week as Israeli forces withdraw from more key areas in the Gaza Strip. We're also seeing a surge, a promised surge in humanitarian aid going into Gaza. That is supposed to go up to something like 600 lorry loads of aid a day. Already the UN's humanitarian agency saying that yesterday, some 630 lorry loads of aid were able to enter into Gaza, about half of those going into the north of the Gaza Strip, where they are, of course, desperately needed. But still a lot of questions about this deal, which has been brokered by the US, along with regional mediators as well. I mean, it's raised hopes of an end to what has been a really devastating war in Gaza. And, you know, also hopes of the return of those hostages. But really, you know, what happens? There's still so much uncertainty about really whether the fighting will resume after this initial 6 weeks, and also what is the future of Gaza, particularly when it comes to its governance. We saw that Hamas was very present in Gaza during the release of these hostages.
OK, thank you, Yolande, for now. Yolande Knell there, who's in Jerusalem for us. And I spoke to Benjamin Raad, who's a political scientist at the UCLA Centre for Middle East Development. I asked him how hopeful this ceasefire will last.
It's a fragile situation. There's been some signs that it's moving forward. Obviously, we've seen the release of some of the hostages and some prisoners in exchange. But at the same time, there is, reports that Netanyahu is waiting to get the specific names of the next round of hostages to be released before he proceeds. And then we have comments like those made by the nominee for the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, who, when asked earlier today in the United States, said that there is no two-state solution on the horizon. So you have situations and comments like that that really underscore how this agreement does not provide a pathway beyond the release of the hostages. In other words, what is going to happen afterwards? What's going to happen with Hamas and their position in Gaza, and Netanyahu's statement that Hamas leadership will not be tolerated going forward.
This ceasefire, and they have to start discussing, because 16 days into phase one, they start to discuss and negotiate phase two. And yet those families who still have loved ones who are held hostage in Gaza must be desperate to know that this will carry on. It will continue. When we saw those 3 women return yesterday, you could just feel the emotion with regards to all of that.
Indeed. And it underscores really, the human face of all of this, that despite the ongoing conflict between these two parties that's been going for decades now, that you do have these families, you do have these young people, especially these women in particular, and also the young men and those who are infirm, those who are injured as well. I mean, we know there's some very young children there. And so absolutely, this is a motivating factor, and one that I think will keep the pressure on both sides to try to keep this ongoing. But again, there's a lot that could happen to derail this. We just hope that it doesn't end up being the case.